Welcome to the Screen the Screener College Basketball Podcast with your hosts, Mike Randall and Gus Kearns.
I come from an Italian family. Every Christmas Eve, my mother would have the Italian side of the family over for Christmas Eve dinner. She would spend all day cooking, cleaning, getting stuff ready, my dad helping around the house, getting things cleaned up. And here comes the family. Here comes the two sisters and the brothers and the nieces and the nephews. And everybody would come over and have such a great time. And her father, who was old school Italian, my grandfather, would often walk around the house. And he was a great guy, great grandfather, really was. But he played the serious grandfather role, right? And he went up to my mother at the end of one Christmas Eve and he said, "This coffee is terrible. You gotta make some more coffee. Come on, can't you make me a decent cup of coffee? It's Christmas Eve, for goodness sakes." Just railing on her about the coffee. And I remember this. I was like 5 or 6 years old. Later on, I go downstairs and my mother is crying by the washing machine. And my dad's down there talking to her. And I hear her, because I'm hiding on the stairs like all children do, because they do hear their parents. "I don't understand why they criticize. I worked so hard on this. I don't understand the criticism. It was a great night. I just don't know why he's like that." Now, part of that could just be a daughter overreacting to her father. And part of it, the side that I think, is a father being too hard on his daughter. But what I don't get is when you don't see the big picture. It's Christmas. It's a holiday. The families are together. Everyone's healthy. It's happy. Who cares about the coffee? Who cares if it's not strong enough or it's burned or whatever? It doesn't matter. See the big picture. And that's how I feel about the net. That's how I feel about the NCAA's new net rankings debut. Folks, the criticisms are out there. How is Loyola Marymount number 10 in the country? How is Ohio State number 1? I know, because Ohio State lost at home to Syracuse tonight, which I picked correctly. Thank you very much. Oh, look at these rankings. Radford. Oh, Radford. How can they be good? Because Radford is good. And it's great to see teams like Radford ranked number 21 and 22, because they don't get any press ever. Newsflash, guys. See the big picture. Don't be the grandfather. Don't be the angry dad about the coffee. Don't be that guy. You know why? Because outside of us, the college basketball hoop junkies, everyone else who follows college basketball casually says what? The regular season doesn't matter. Wake me up during the NCAA tournament. That's what everyone who's a casual college basketball fan says. So spare me, all you hardcore college basketball fans, and we love you, because me and Gus are two of them as well. Don't criticize unless you have a better option. And if you do, let's talk about it. Because you know what all this did? It got us to talk about teams that we would have never talked about in mainstream. It got us to start arguing about rankings. It got us to start talking about March Madness and all the people in the NCAA who get ridiculed and made fun of for their disconnect from what's going on in their ivory towers. You know what they did? They won. And they're sitting there smoking cigars and they're laughing because they took a page out of college football that does this whole bowl championship reveal show and the prelude to the bowl championship reveal show and who's going to be in the playoffs. And they basically have dragged it out the entire year. So congratulations. I applaud the NCAA for doing exactly what they should be doing to try to grow the greatest sport on God's green earth. And they're getting us to talk about it. A couple of years ago, it was the early season matchups. We don't start with the horrific team versus the powerhouse team. Now we start with Michigan State, Kansas. Now we start with Zion Williamson windmill dunks all over Kentucky. And that whets our appetite. And then we have feast week, and we feast on turkey, and we feast on tournaments, and we feast on neutral sites, and we see people in the sun and the beach, and we wish we were there. And then it sort of dies again, right? Wrong. So now we're talking about the net, and it's better than the RPI. It's a step in the right direction. Guys, Loyola Marymount won't be the number 10 team in the country at the end of the year. Relax. But if you look at the release of the net rankings, is it really that bad? Top 10 teams. Ohio State. Well, why is Ohio State number 1? You want to know why? They went to Cincinnati and they won. Not easy. They went to Creighton and they won. Also, not easy. That's why. They've played 6 games and they have 2 wins on the road against fairly decent teams, by the way, both of which were in the tournament last year. That's why. So it's consistent in rewarding those wins. Who else? Virginia. Is that wrong? Is that wrong? Tonight they just spanked Maryland in Maryland. Got that one right also, by the way. Is that wrong? Oh, well, they lost to a 16th seed, right? Oh my goodness, that was the worst loss ever. No, it wasn't. And they play without DeAndre Hunter, who's going to be a lottery pick this year, by the way, when you guys catch up to what all of us who are college basketball hoops junkies knew last year. Texas Tech, very under the radar. Jared Culver has been tremendous. Michigan, Gonzaga, they okay? Gonzaga okay? Being ranked number 5 after the only team that beat Duke? How's that one? Pretty good? Then Duke, Michigan State, Wisconsin, who's played phenomenally well. Escaped last night against NC State at home, but played phenomenally well. And after getting down early with Ethan Happ getting 2 fouls there in the championship game over Feast Week, they came back and kept it a close game with Virginia. Impressive. Then Virginia Tech, then Loyola Marymount. I know. There's going to be things when you have a small sample size. I'm a math major. I had a math major in college. When you have a small sample size, there's chaos. It's why somebody can go to a casino and they can win hundreds upon hundreds of dollars right away. Because it's a small sample size. But you know why the casino then hands that person a free room? And then hands them a free dinner? And then comps them? And then gives them stuff to keep them there? Because in the long run, the casinos always win. And in the long run, college basketball will win when we talk about the net. And we talk about rankings. And we don't just wait till March when people fill out brackets by their favorite color or their favorite mascot. So stop criticizing the coffee when you get this incredible dinner during the holidays of college basketball 24/7. Don't worry about it. It'll work itself out. And so today, what did we do? We went out and we brought in an analytics expert who's a former video coordinator for New Mexico State, Jordan Sperber. Jordan not only has the math mind, the analytics mind. Follow him on Twitter at HoopVision68. Check out his YouTube channel where he actually compared the net versus what he feels is another great measurement, wins above bubble, and was popularized at first back in 2015 by Jason Lisk of the Big Lead. He talked about wins above bubble being a substantial improvement over the RPI. And what that tells you, it tells you that every single win that a team has during the year has value. The quadrant system is better, but it still is arbitrary in which quadrant you're in. Why is it RPI 1 to 50? Why? Why is it that? Does that matter? No, it's arbitrary. So this would give you a numerical score based on years of data on how the typical bubble team would perform in that game. It takes into account location, neutral site, strength of opponent, everything. So that may be a better measurement, but maybe that will come about with conversation. How does change happen in society? Conversation. People draw attention. They annoy. They bring things up. They come forward. They discuss. That's how change is made. And by having the net released early, all of these discussions have come to the forefront. And Jordan Sperber is going to give us a great breakdown. He has a video where he breaks down the side-by-side comparison. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about the net. We'll talk about what we think is good and what we think is bad about it. And then he'll also give us his story on how he got from high school basketball star to video coordinator working with Eric Musselman of Nevada and Chris Jans of New Mexico State. Two pretty darn good coaches. So Jordan's going to come on, give us the whole rundown. He has a podcast, the Solving Basketball Podcast, which gives you X's and O's, and there's not enough X's and O's here. We certainly need to take more in. And so Jordan comes on. He's kind enough to give us a few minutes, and we're going to talk about it. And we're going to talk about positive things, and we're going to be talking about college basketball in November. That's a good thing. So let's bring Jordan on and hear what he has to say. Folks, we have a fantastic guest for you today. Please welcome to the show Jordan Sperber. Jordan is an analytics expert and the former video coordinator for New Mexico State's basketball team. He is one of the best basketball minds on the internet. He blends hoops passion and analytics together perfectly. Please follow him on Twitter at HoopVision68. He has a great YouTube channel, HoopVision68, and he just started his podcast, which is a must-listen, the Solving Basketball Podcast. We are thrilled to have Jordan on the pod today to give us a few minutes. Jordan, thanks so much for joining us. How you doing?
Thank you for having me, Mike. I'm doing well, and I really appreciate that intro. I hope I can live up to it here.
You can live up to it. If people will just listen to your story and then go to the YouTube channel, that will more than make up for it. Your story on how you got involved in both the Nevada basketball program and New Mexico State program is fascinating. You can give us this unique behind-the-scenes look on how someone who has a passion for college basketball, started at the high school level, then can become part of the program, even if they're not a player on the college team, although you were a very accomplished high school player. Give us your background and summary of the experiences and the path that you had working in college hoops.
Yeah, it's a little bit non-traditional for sure. So I would say, I don't want to just throw out a number, but I will anyways. 75% of all college basketball staffers were probably either players or former managers. That's the traditional route to D1 basketball coaching. And the other 25%, give or take, do have some interesting stories. And so for me, it was basically I started a Twitter account and a blog as a junior in high school, focused on analytics, and no one was really reading it. Even in college, when it got a little bit bigger, no one still was really reading it in terms of sheer numbers. But fortunately, a few head coaches were interested in it, and the first two that reached out to me were Eric Musselman, who at the time was at Arizona State as a assistant coach, and Paul Weir, who was the associate head coach at New Mexico State. And those two both progressed to head coaches at the college level, and they were my first two jobs after I graduated from college.
Yeah, and that's the way to go, is if you have a passion and you work through things, you will find a way. And that's exactly what you did. And a lot of what you talk about on your podcast is how you prepared the team for an upcoming opponent. And that's something that I always wanted to take a closer look at. You know, on the high school level, I coached varsity basketball. You know, we talk things in state games here and there. A player, for example, will take 2 dribbles with his left hand and then spin to the right. And maybe you get lucky. I saw Brad Davison last night in Wisconsin take 5 charges. Maybe you can take a charge here or there based off a scouting report. So I'm just curious, take us through how you would prepare Coach Jans and the Aggies for an upcoming opponent. And let's reflect back on, was there a numerical focus that you would sort of try to get the players to focus on, or was your job to sort of keep it simple and not have the players overanalyze what they're supposed to do? Just how much in detail did you do, and then how was it translated to the players?
Yeah, so the way college basketball staffs are structured is there's a head coach who obviously has some role in every single scout, but really there are 3 assistant coaches who are usually rotating. So an assistant coach will be the lead scout for a game. And then my role as video coordinator was to assist the lead scouter, basically. And depending on how busy that person was with recruiting or how many games they had in a row to scout, my role would be bigger or smaller. But it's a neat thing to be a video coordinator at the D1 level, because you have a hand in every game and you get to watch a lot of basketball and learn about the game. As far as the numbers go, I would say that we used analytics in the scouting process a lot more than the average team, although it is fairly prevalent now. At the very least, I feel like most teams are pulling up KenPom, and that's one of the first things they do in the process. As far as what we gave to the players, it was different for every head coach that I worked with. Sometimes you don't really need to give them the numbers so much as the coaching advice based off of those analytics or based off of those numbers.
That's what I'm thinking, because I would think there are some players who you could tell, for example, that a player in the post is usually going to go to an up and under move, let's say when he's on the right block. And some players can process that information and then defend accordingly. And I would think there would be other players who are just so instinctual that if you gave them that information, it may actually cause them to be less efficient.
Yes, I agree. Let's say they've done the up and under 33% of post-ups. They don't necessarily need to know 33. They just need, that's the move that they do. But one thing that I think people underestimate is we definitely gave them a ton of information, not necessarily numbers, but the amount of, and it depends on the coach, but the amount of plays that we go over in terms of the other team, all the personnel stuff we do on a relatively short time frame, depending on how long you have in between games. By the end of the season, these guys have had 30 scouts, and they're pretty good at remembering all of this stuff. And I think that maybe players don't get enough credit for that sometimes.
Jordan, with your preparation for the teams, is there someone who is really excelling, a coaching staff, a team, or a conference, let's say, that has a very tough and unique approach that makes it more difficult for you to prepare for? Off the top of my head, of course, I'm thinking John Beilein is a fantastic, amazing coach, but their defense at Michigan really changed when Luke Lockledge came on last year. And this year, of course, you saw what they did when they went out to Villanova on defense. So was there a team or a coach, let's say, that when you were going up against them and you're getting stuff ready, you're like, wow, this is going to be a complicated one?
Yep. I've talked about this a little bit on my podcast, and I have two answers for you. St. Mary's, we played them in the non-conference last year, lost 92-74. We only lost 6 games last year, and that was probably our worst loss. They run really, really good ball screen stuff that is just hard to guard. And then the other one, which is a little bit lesser known, is Utah Valley.
Sure.
Mark Pope.
Yep.
Mark Pope is the coach there, and he's a conference opponent. So I played against them 4 times in the last 2 years, and I always felt like with them, it almost didn't matter what your defensive coverage was. Their offense is structured in a way that it is way more about what they're doing than what you're doing. It's something that I actually want to dive into a little bit more, but the analytics back it up a little bit. Lost a couple years ago, which was a really bad loss, and in that same year they won at BYU. It was like the best WAC win of the season and the worst WAC loss of the season, and I think that it might have something to do with Pope's style.
You focus a lot on X's and O's on your podcast, which is tremendous. I think it's something that really is undercovered here nationally. I think there's a growing chasm between the X and O technicians and then coaches that I refer to as let's go guys. We here at Screen the Screener love the technicians, the chess matches, the Tony Bennett's. Rick Majerus, I got to see at clinics years ago. He was spectacular, second to none. Hubie Brown, of course, legendary. Rick Majerus used that triangle and 2, made a championship game against Kentucky, right? As basketball purists, we love that. But I do feel like many coaches, and I've sort of talked about this with Coach K, who obviously is a legendary coach, one of the best of all time, but I think he has shifted his focus to chemistry building. And obviously when you get the top 3 recruits in the country, maybe that's a smart move. But I don't know if he's doing as many X's and O's, and I felt like Mark Few really was able to sort of take advantage of some situations there, more so in an X and O fashion than Krzyzewski did in Gonzaga's win recently over Duke. In your time working as a video coordinator, did you see that chasm? Were there certain coaches and teams that would say, listen, this is more of a feel, chemistry, motion offense, freelance versus someone else who is, scripting the quick hitters and really going through specific situations? Is that chasm something that you saw, or is that something maybe that I'm overvaluing?
No doubt. I guess the one pushback I would have from that is just because a team is running 100 different quick hitters, which there are for sure teams that are doing that, doesn't necessarily mean that their X's and O's are better. So I guess the biggest example would be Villanova, who doesn't really run much of any sophistication, but they, at least over the course of their 4-year career, they really learn how to play within that system,
right,
which is X's and O's, just a different type of X's and O's. But every coach emphasizes different things, and there are especially a lot of really good defensive coaches that don't have the incentive within their program to grow offensively. And some of them are running things that were maybe at one point relevant in the game 10, 15 years ago, but not so much now. But at least those teams have their defensive identity, that, the gritty, the tough, and that's what wins them games more so than the X's and O's, I guess.
In your experience, do you see, Jordan, that there's more push towards the separate defensive coach, almost like in Michigan, and a separate offensive coach? Or do you think that that's rare and it's still usually the head coach is really involved in both ends? Because, of course, traditionally, your head coach ran both sides of the ball. The assistants, of course, would help. But it's almost becoming like a big business, I think, where defensive specialists or offensive specialists are coming aboard to help. Is that a trend that you're seeing also?
Yeah, it depends on where you're at, I think, in terms of the number one priority for assistant coaches at most programs is going to be recruiting. And so you're getting hired based off of that. John Beeline for sure has the luxury of being able to hire a defensive guy. I think I've read an article about the hiring surrounding Yaklich and how he was looking for a defensive guy. But at a lot of schools, recruiting is so vital that it's going to take a priority. Now, I do think that associate head coaches, the ones that are longtime assistant coaches that have gotten that promotion, they do tend to be maybe an offensive coordinator, maybe a defensive coordinator on one side of the ball, but not a lot have both. I think there is a trend towards at least having one guy and then the head coach is the other side, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes total sense, yeah. And listen, as I mentioned earlier about your video there that you talked about the net, let's of course touch on that. So the NCAA releases the standings on the net, right, without giving us the algorithm. I still think it's a step in the right direction. You did a fantastic video on the Twitter account where you explained why wins above bubble would be a better measure than sort of the archaic quadrant system that, sort of is totally subjective in terms of how you're going to place them. I don't like when people complain about a ranking or a stat, but then don't give an option. Don't come at me with a complaint if you don't have a solution, but that's not what Jordan Sperber does. So give us your thoughts on the net versus the wins above bubble and exactly what your thoughts are and why that would be sort of a better measurement.
Yeah, it's a little bit, it's funny with wins above bubble. It's a little bit complicated at first, but I've actually talked about it with D1 coaches, and once you get past the initial barrier, it's super simple. And it's probably best for that YouTube format where you can kind of visualize it a little bit. But the idea with the quadrant system is to break every game up into either it's a quadrant 1, a quadrant 2, a quadrant 3, or a quadrant 4, win or loss. And obviously beating the number 1 team in the country is not the same as beating the number 25 team in the country. But if you're using just 4 quadrants, it's being treated as exactly the same. And so wins above bubble, if I'm giving a little elevator sale for it, is a system that isn't discrete with the 4 bins, the 4 quadrants, but it's continuous. So every win is valued properly, and the end result is how many more wins do I have? And it doesn't have to be a whole number. It could be 2.6. How many more wins do I have than the average bubble team would have had given that they played my schedule?
Yeah, that's the key. Listen, I think the net goes in the is taking a step in the right direction. And honestly, Jordan, I think all conversation is good. I know a lot of people were criticizing when the selection committee released their top 4 seeds. But to me, if we're talking about college basketball, it's great. That being said, I don't know if Ohio State being number 1 and Loyola Marymount being number 10, is something that people are going to be able to overlook. But I do think the net is certainly better than the RPI, no?
Right. Yeah. I saw someone tweet about actually what RPI looks like right now, and it does look worse than that was. Well, the RPI is an incredibly low standard to be beating. But the moral of the story is that we do need to give it some time for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I agree, especially when you're talking about a small sample size, in the beginning of the year. Jordan, listen, we appreciate a few minutes. Last thing I got to touch on, I was listening to your podcast the other day, and you talked about going in the gym and shooting 100 free throws by yourself, no rebounder, which is a huge difference, by the way. You did it 3 times, and I believe if I had the average right, did you average 90 or 91 makes out of 100?
It was right around there.
And then you had coaches on. I think you had the San Francisco coach on as well, and he was saying between 75 and 79, somewhere in there. So I listen, you're quite an accomplished guy here. We can get you out there as well doing on teaching everybody how to make free throws.
So yeah, that's I asked that question to every guest on the podcast. How many free throws would you make in a row, or how many free throws would you make out of 100 if you shot them all in a row? And I think it's been a fun question when you have Ken Pomeroy versus the head coach of USF, Kyle Smith. It's kind of funny to hear the different answers. But yeah, I feel like there's no way anyone would ask that question as their continuous podcast question unless they weren't a good free throw shooter themselves. So yeah, I guess that's where it came from. But yeah, it's fun to see the different answers. And a little known fact here is that for about a 2-year period, I could dunk too. So there's that.
I had one chance to dunk, and I got up there, went off the back rim, and when I landed in high school, I said, that's never going to be closer than that. That was pretty much it. But we did have a fundraiser once at the school, and I had to go against I guess it was a 9th grader in a free throw contest. And I was not a great free throw shooter, 65%, whatever it was in high school. Somehow I made 10 out of 10, and that's my claim to fame. But you making 95 out of 100, that's impressive, man. So I think besides all the great stuff you're doing on the YouTube channel, everything, we got to promote that a little bit more. Folks, Jordan Sperber, analytics expert, tremendous follow on Twitter at HoopsVision68. The YouTube channel as well, and of course his podcast, the Solving Basketball Podcast. Great X's and O's, has fantastic guests. A must listen. Jordan, thanks so much for a few minutes, man. And it's going to be an exciting season with everything going on, and we're thrilled to have you on here on the podcast for a little bit.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was fun, and I really appreciate you having me on, Mike.
No problem, Jordan. Thanks.